I was thinking about how to do this and thought that starting with some origin primary stuff and doing some intellectual history was important before kind of just immediately jumping into Kant. So I didn't really think that there was a way of figuring out metaphysics or talking about metaphysics without starting from the beginning. So we're going to start in the cave. Metaphysics is the science or study of the principle of things, that which exists beyond the phenomena of senses and the realm of the physical. So the realm of the physical, things that we experience phenomenologically, things that we experience with taste, touch, sight, smell, etc. Metaphysics has a lot of different definitions throughout history. If you were to attempt to do a Google search, what is metaphysics, you could come across many different definitions. It's as ephemeral as its area of study itself. Most people think that its origins, at least in the West, so kind of a caveat here, this will primarily cover Western, well, actually will exclusively cover Western thoughts on metaphysics. There are certainly alternatives to that that are also meaningful and perhaps different. That is not the focus of this. But it has its origins in the Greeks, so Aristotle, Plato. It has to do with an understanding not of physical matter, but of the essence. It has to do with being, knowing, identity, time, space, substance. We begin with the cave, also known as Plato's allegory of the cave, which is that without philosophy we cannot see. Just to determine how fast I should go through this, how many of you are familiar with the allegory of the cave? Okay, so I won't go too quickly then. See, I'm doing my best, Sterling. We'll get through it. So, allegory of the cave is an important work in Western philosophy because it attempts to answer the question of why live a philosophical life. So if you've heard something like the unexamined life is not worth living or some trite expression like that, all of it comes down to this notion that the pathway not towards happiness, which is arbitrary and difficult to understand, but flourishing. What does it mean to flourish? For Plato and for Aristotle, meant to do philosophy, to study philosophy. So the allegory of the cave. We've got some prisoners. They're tied up in a cave facing a wall. Their whole life, this is how they've lived. They've never lived outside of this cave. Their image of reality is the shadows that they see cast on the wall by various objects. These objects are being carried around unbeknownst to them by various prisoners. So we imagine that all we see for all of our life is just shadows on a wall. If we were to experience the world solely phenomenologically, by what we could see, touch, taste, smell, hear, etc., then these shadows are what is real. Like, these shadows are the real world to us. In the story, the one prisoner is set free. Upon release, the prisoner, of course, realizes that their entire worldview was merely shadows. They realized that they're shadows of true objects, and that the entire reality was a shadow of true reality. The prisoner leaves the cave and for the first time knows the world and sees the sun. So this image of leaving the cave and seeing light, seeing the sun, is kind of a metaphor for philosophy, and a metaphor for the study of metaphysics, and is an allegory that says that if we are to solely live our lives via our own experiences, we will only see shadows. We will never see what is real. And we know this is true because people have extremely different perspectives. Like, if we ask ourselves, for example, in an IR context, why do two sides view the exact same thing through such different lenses, and that emerges in the form of conflict? Why do two different cultures view things differently? Why do religions result in differences? None of these things are wrong per se. Instead, it's just that each one of us, based on our own senses and our own upbringing and our own understanding, each has a snapshot of reality. We have it all taken a single photograph. We don't have the whole camera reel put together. After seeing the true world, the prisoner descends back to the cave, but after being acclimated, has difficulty seeing the shadow world, and can no longer look at the shadows and accept them for what they are, because every time the prisoner sees the shadows, they know that those aren't actually real. And it becomes to be very difficult for the prisoner. They don't know what is real and what is not real anymore? What if the world that they just emerged into, where the light touched everything and we went from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions, what if that was also a shadow? What then? The peers, so in this story, Plato says that the prisoner gets berated by the peers. So in this example, it's probably the case that the prisoner is Socrates. And for those of us who are familiar, Socrates was not treated very well by his peers at the end of his life. And I think that this is a metaphor for Socrates leaves the cave, comes back to Athens, gets in a bunch of arguments with people, ends up being berated and thought of as a fool. And because the philosopher questions the world feels threatened by them. So that's the allegory of the cave. And the reason that it is worth studying philosophy is because absent the examination of the philosophical world, absent the examination of metaphysical questions, we only see shadows. Anyone have thoughts about the allegory of the cave or questions about this, or are we good? We good? Yeah, the allegory makes sense? Yes? Okay. All right, so the second kind of Platonic thing I want to discuss that's really important is something called the forms. So for Plato, the world is split between being and becoming. Anyone in a debate round have debates where the neg is like there was only ever one question, that of being versus becoming? Anyone have debates about being versus becoming at any point? No? Okay, well, good for you, I suppose. But basically, the start of all of that, so there's a lot of people writing about it in the context of Deleuze or Bataille or Baudrillard. All of it begins with Plato, and all of it begins with this world of being split into forms. So let's imagine like this table, for instance. And we can all agree this is a table, yes? At what point, if I start removing stuff from the table, if I remove a leg, or I remove a fixture, or I remove a slice of the plastic, and I strip away layer after layer, at what point would we no longer call it a table? At what point does the table lose its tableness? And secondly, at what point, if I were to replace this table with new parts, so I got in a new leg, a new top, I redid the surface area, at what point does it become a different table that no longer has the same essence? There's kind of this like ship of Thebes example that people give. Anyone hear this one? Yes? What is this?
It's like you have a ship, but then you like take it apart piece by piece and put it back together. Is it still the same?
And you replace it, right? You replace it with new parts. Yeah.
Yes. Like you take it apart piece by piece and you find a new version of that exact same part and then you put it back together. Is it still the same ship or is it a different ship?
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so basically the difference between a phenomenological examination of the table is that it's just its constituent components. A metaphysical question of what is the table is what is the essence that makes up the table, and at what point do we no longer describe it as that, or your chair, or your laptop, or anything. Like, at what point does a thing lose its thingness? And so there is a world that is composed of matter, so there's physical stuff that is always becoming, that is just shadow. And then there is the world of being, which is the thing as it is, the thing's essence. So an object has two different forms, the form that is being and the form that is becoming. And a lot of Western philosophy is fundamentally about this question. So like Heidegger is very interested in exploring this, Deleuze is extremely interested in exploring this, Lacan, most critiques that you have debated are very interested in this particular metaphysical distinction. And the last part is Aristotle has a theory that's called hylomorphism. So it's hylomorphism, which is that every object is both form and matter at the same time, that they are inseparable from each other. All right, so that's a brief introduction to the Greeks. And it is, I think, one of my favorite things about doing research for this lecture was kind of realizing that a lot of these questions are questions that have been debated for thousands of years that don't have very good answers. And I think it is very interesting that several thousand years of intellectual debate over moral philosophy becomes condensed down oftentimes to a 6-minute rebuttal and a 3-minute response to that rebuttal. I find that fascinating. Okay, so we're going to jump ahead like 1,500 years to the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment is a return to a study of antiquity. So Europe emerging from the Middle Ages. There are a bunch of geopolitical reasons that resulted in this that if you want to know more about that, I would ask Turner about it. He would probably talk to you about feudalism forever if he could. And there was this explosion of the attempt to figure out how it is we can become better humans or perfect the human. So there's this fascination with the human form and figuring out how to improve upon the human. Like, what does it look like to evolve ourselves and improve upon ourselves? And there's a big renewed interest in Greco-Roman thought and philosophy and art and literature. I'm sure everyone is familiar with the Enlightenment. I think now we're caught up. So René Descartes is an important person in this because it's hard to say for sure whether he invented the idea. So there are going to be some times in this where I'm like, this person invented this idea. Obviously, probably not true. They're probably the first person who wrote about it in a way that was reported and published and given credit for it. Obviously, I'm sure you know with researching copyright that this stuff is a little complicated. But he's kind of given credit with the founding the notion of epistemology, the study of epistemology. So how do we know things? Descartes says that we should think about not just about what exists, but also about what knowledge exists, how we come to know that knowledge exists, and why we think it exists. Descartes has a very machinic view of the world. And by that I mean that metaphysics and philosophy in general has a mind-body problem. The mind and the body for him are separate. They're not one and uniform. There is the mind that is totally free and limitless, and there is the body which is restricted by a deterministic, machinic, limited world. So, put simply, in our dreams we can fly, we can jump across buildings, we can imagine ourselves growing wings, we can imagine ourselves turning into someone else, we can do anything. We're totally free in our minds, for the most part at least. Our bodies, though, are really limited. Like, if we could just do whatever we wanted with our bodies that our mind could come up with, life would be extremely different. And a big metaphysical question undergirding a lot of his thinking is like, what does that then imply, and what does that mean for us? The fact that we have the capacity to just invent such fantastical stories, even though there is no basis for them in reality. And for Descartes, that made a lot of philosophy that was based on phenomenology really disappointing. It's really limiting to be like the way that how do we know what we know? Well, we look at the world and we see it as it is. The gap between that and what our minds are capable of is so many orders of magnitude that it is kind of boring and sad and a shadow, if you will, right? It is back. Basically, our experiences are like the shadows on the cave. And no matter how much we travel the world, we will always be able to travel further in our minds, right? And this notion that we are capable of constructing these complex imaginations bursts the evil demon problem. So how familiar are we with the evil demon? No? You all did this a little bit though, didn't you, at GDS? Maybe not. Okay, so the evil demon is the skeptical problem that plagues Descartes and influences a lot of his philosophy. If a sensory experience could be caused by a dream, then it is impossible to say that is not a dream. Or in the evil demon case, caused by an evil demon. We could also imagine like a supercomputer or an intelligent god or a fairy godmother, whatever your substitute is for the evil demon. If you could dream a thing and you sense, you experience that thing with your touch, your taste, your smell, how can you possibly rule out that you are dreaming? And for a long time, he couldn't figure out the answer to this problem, and a lot of his meditations are attempting to figure this out. So Descartes is also primarily doing analytic philosophy. So analytic philosophy is very different than a lot of the philosophy we're used to in debate. So a lot of debate philosophies is like we theorize stuff, we theorize a structure, and then we kind of look at stuff to figure out how it fits in, and then we make conjectures about it, and we postulate about it, and have debates that are very hypothetical. For the analytic philosophers, philosophy is much more like a math problem. The way that philosophy works is that we can rationally use our reason to compute an exact answer, and it is unfulfilling to leave so much up to chance or up to debate or up to uncertainty. We should know, in the same way we know 1 and 1 make 2, we need an exact answer logically, where we use definitions in the form of syllogisms. So the Descartesian syllogism for the evil demon is as follows. The first premise, so their syllogisms have premises and then conclusions that follow from the premises. The evil demon syllogism is premise 1, I know a proposition only if I can rule out the possibility of being false. So I know a proposition only if I can rule out the possibility of it being false. Premise 2, if I am being deceived by an evil demon, then all propositions I believe are false. Premise 2, if I am being deceived by an evil demon, then all propositions I believe are false. Given premise 1 and premise 2, what could we say logically must be our conclusion based on those two premises? So first, can only know a thing is true if I can rule it out as being false. Pretty straightforward. 2, if there's an evil demon, then I can't rule out the possibility of everything being false. Yeah?
You can never rule something true.
So that I don't think is a conclusion that necessarily follows, because premise 2 is if I am being deceived. Premise 2 is not I am being deceived. Like Descartes, in the same way that you or I cannot prove the existence of an evil demon, right? Like Descartes is not engaging in non-falsifiable pseudo-scientific nonsense here. He's a serious individual with a very serious mustache. He wants to be very analytic about this. So we're not going to be using non-falsifiable conjectures to presume the existence of the evil demon or not. So any other idea? Yeah.
It can only be true if I'm not being deceived by the demon.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So therefore, in order to know a proposition, I need to rule out the evil demon possibility. In order to know a proposition, I need to rule out the evil demon possibility. Premise 3, I cannot rule out the evil deceiver possibility. Can't rule it out. How could you? I mean, how could you possibly know with 100% certainty that you are not dreaming this? And the fact that you go to sleep, you dream stuff, it's very complex. Like, you can't know that you're not in a simulation, if we're going to take the Matrix example. You cannot know with absolute certainty that you are not that. We can be pretty sure. There's a lot of reasons to believe that we're not in a simulation, for example. But we can't be 100% sure. So the second conclusion, conclusion 2, is therefore I lack knowledge. So we syllogistically are incapable of saying that we know anything because we cannot rule out this possibility. And syllogistically, we by definition cannot rule out say that we know things until we've ruled out the possibility. And this is kind of the thing that haunts a lot of Western philosophy, is this idea of how do we know what we know? Is it even worth trying to pursue knowledge? Is it even worth trying to leave the cave if we can never be sure that when we've left the cave and see everything the sunlight touches, if we can't be sure that that is just the second level of the cave, then what is the point of leaving the cave in the first place? What is the difference between cave 1 and cave 2 if we can't rule out that possibility? Are you with me so far? Yes? Okay. So, anyone know his answer to this problem? It's a relatively famous line that's associated with our guy Rene. Yeah, Sterling.
I think before.
Yes, I think therefore I am. What is the explanation of this argument? Anyone know?
A little. It's like because like you know that you're like real to a point, right? It's like
Why? Why do you know that you're real? Well, think about again. So the thing I really want to encourage us to do is don't guess. Like the analytic philosophers are not interested in guessing. They want it to be demonstrated with a syllogism, demonstrated analytically, right? So establish a premise to which a conclusion must by definition follow. And if you want me, I could just like say what his answer is if we don't want to spend time thinking about it. Yes. Okay. So if you are capable of imagining being deceived, if I am being deceived, logically, well, let's start first. There are two possibilities, right? Possibility one, you're being deceived. Possibility two, you're not being deceived, right? That's pretty simple. We could all agree there's two possibilities. If I am being deceived, that implies that there is an I that exists to be deceived. So the evil demon cannot deceive you if you do not exist. And for that reason, you may be deceived by an evil demon, right? We can't rule out that possibility. But we can rule out the possibility that we're not real, right? So we could be brainwashed or whatever, hard to say. But we can rule out this possibility we're not real because either I am not being deceived and I'm real, or I am being deceived and the demon is acting upon the I in that sentence in order to deceive me. So I must exist in order to be deceived. Does this answer make sense? And that is why I think, therefore I am. So this is a huge part of Western Enlightenment philosophy. It is the foundation of the idea that because humans have the capacity for reason, that humans are special, that humans are different, right? That it is a founding idea in humanism. It is very important for Kant, which we'll get to at some point. If you came to Kantian ethics, I spent a bunch of time talking about the second formula of the categorical imperative, that you can't use a human as a means to an end. A big part of that is because humans are special because they have the capacity for reason and abstract reason, that they are aware of their own sense of self-awareness, that they are aware of their own abilities to doubt their self-awareness. And this means that each one of us is unimaginably special compared to anything else. And that is why it's unethical to treat someone as a means to an end. Okay. There's an interesting offshoot to this of like the new evil demon problem is what it's called. And I literally spent like maybe 3 hours reading papers about this and found it very abstract and confusing. So I'm not going to try to explain it in depth, but it is really interesting. If you look up the new evil demon problem, you will find stuff about this. And a lot of it comes from a 1963 paper called Is Justified True Belief Knowledge by Edmund Gettier, I think. And it says, imagine instead of the evil demon scenario, we imagine you have an exact epistemic counterpart. Imagine they are deceived by the evil demon. They're not real. They're an exact replica of you. They're in the matrix. We've created a simulation. We've created a sim. There's an exact copy of you. They had the same parents, the same upbringing. They went to the same debate camp. They tripped up the same set of stairs. They ate the same foods. Every single thing about their life is identical exactly to yours. But they're being deceived by an evil demon, which is, potentially you. Maybe you created the simulation. But they're just a simulation of you. And you know that you're real. And we're just going to pretend for a second that we objectively know that these two things are true. you're certain that your beliefs are real. But why does that then imply that your counterpart's beliefs are not real? And there is a whole debate in epistemology of internalism versus externalism, right? Is knowledge based on factors internal to a person or external to a person? How much of knowledge comes from our own individual capacities to reason versus external stimulus, external, beliefs? If you took, two of the exact same person, gave them the exact same lifestyle, why are sometimes they different? Like identical twins sometimes have radically different personalities, even if they had basically the same upbringing. And this notion is trying to basically get at the premise of why epistemic hubris exists and why epistemological biases exist, and whether or not it really is the case that we should view ourselves as unique and special and perfect and strive to achieve the humanist potential and fulfill the philosophical ideal of getting out of the cave. Like, why is it the case that we're special and our copy is not special? Why is it that our beliefs are real, the evil demon deceived beliefs are not real? So in the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was a bunch of movies made about this premise. So most famously The Matrix, but also there's a movie called Existenz, spelled with a Z at the end. There's a movie called The 13th Floor. There are a bunch of them, but those two in particular are very, very good, are essentially encountering this exact issue and conundrum. And if you like kind of thinking about weird stuff like this and you liked The Matrix, I'd recommend those. Okay, so brief, one more stop along the way is Hume, David Hume. Skepticism, big component of metaphysics as well. David Hume is generally pretty skeptical of speculative metaphysics. He basically says that everything that I've talked about in the first 30 minutes of this lecture is a total waste of time. Like, who cares? Really fascinating that, like, there is this potential sunlit world if we step out of the cave. Really cool. It's cool that there's a being and that all we interact with is the world of becoming. Fascinating. Not actually useful. Knowledge is solely determined by experience. That's it. We're not God. We're not AGI. We're not super intelligent beings. Experience is fallible because of the problem of induction. And the problem of induction being circular, the problem of induction being based on our senses, which are not very good. Therefore, knowledge is totally impossible. The set of questions that we have been grappling with since Plato have gotten kind of nowhere. All we can do is just debate hypotheticals in the non-phenomenological world, but we are limited by our senses, and so we should attempt to figure out ethics and morality via our senses. And he says this about metaphysics. So if you don't like this lecture so far, then maybe you're like David Hume. He says, quote, "We should commit it to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion." Commit the whole thing to the flames. And he thinks there's no theory of reality that is possible. The Kantian ethics portion of this, I went in a little more depth on the problem of induction, but if you are interested in researching it yourself, if you just type in David Hume, problem of induction, you will find a lot of stuff about it. Or you could consult someone who knows or had attended that lecture. All right, so last 20 minutes or so we could spend on Kant. So the lead-in from Hume is extremely important. Hume's direct attack on metaphysics, we should commit it to the flames, prompted a lot of what made Kant interested in writing and thinking and making philosophy. Because if you think about it, this combination of Descartes' notion of the evil demon and whether or not it's even worthwhile to achieve knowledge, Hume's idea that even if it was worthwhile to achieve knowledge, our senses are fallible, so it fails, is kind of a horrifying one. It is in some ways pretty upsetting and disturbing if basically all of human history's attempt to figure out what it means to be human and how we could better ourselves has just been a total waste of time, and we're never going to be able to achieve it. And Kant writes this about Hume. I freely admit that it was the remembrance of David Hume which many years ago first interrupted my dogmatic slumber and gave my investigations in the field of speculative philosophy a completely different direction. So he kind of woke up Kant from the cave. And Kant thinks that the only way of dealing with Hume's problem is to use a priori reasoning. So it is unsatisfying as a conclusion to say knowledge based on experience fails, therefore we have no knowledge. That's not a very satisfying conclusion for Kant, and he accepts that that is true and wants to find a different way to justify epistemology, and that is a priori reasoning. So reasoning that exists prior to experience. He says that metaphysics until now has remained in such a wavering state of uncertainty and contradictions is to be ascribed solely to the fact that this problem, and perhaps even the distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments, was not thought of earlier. Metaphysics stands or falls with the solution to this problem, or on a satisfactory proof that the possibility required to be explained is not in fact obtained. So, put in a sentence that is more simple, if metaphysics cannot grapple with the problem of phenomenology, then the entire field collapses in on itself. And so the thing we should be doing with our lives is figuring out an alternative to theorizing knowledge and theorizing the world that does not rely on experience. This is a shift in philosophy that would change the world forever. In my notes, for this elective, I described Kant as the most important philosopher of all time. I think that's true. I think that without Kant, or at least someone who had similar ideas to him, it didn't have to be him specifically, but if someone hadn't written this down and published it and had it well read, we would still be stuck in the cave, allegorically speaking. Metaphysics, the study of what there is, the world beyond physical attributes. Kant is trying to answer two questions. One, what is the human? Or differently, what is the subject? So a lot of critique debating, you probably debate over what subjectivity is, or subject formation, or whatever. This is the origin of that, so this is trying to figure out what is that? What does it mean to be a human being? And second, what is substance? There's a big problem with philosophical questions through reason, which is that we cannot answer all questions simply through logic. So antinomies, two things run into barriers with each other, contradictions that can't be explained through reason. The biggest of which is the contradiction of God and reason. So for Kant and anyone writing at the time, the Christian God is fact. Like, it's in the same way that you think 2 + 2 = 4, for Kant, God exists. The God that exists is the Christian God that is, proselytized or whatever by the church. So it's taken as a fact that God exists. And maybe you all don't like God anymore or whatever, that's fine. But just let's assume that we're living in a world where we think some sort of entity exists that is real. So Kant takes it a fact that God exists, takes it a fact that freedom exists, right? So God exists, freedom exists. Freedom and the ability for people to pursue their own ends and their own needs is foundational for what it means to make a human human. And maybe there's some debate to be had over what freedom is or who has access to freedom, but let's assume for a second that we could all agree on the fact that there is something that exists that restricts our freedom fundamentally, kind of metaphysically, our freedoms are restricted. And remember, before, when we talked about this, we were talking about it in terms of the mind versus the body, right? The mind is free, the body is not free. So this is kind of a different version of that to some extent. There cannot be an omnipotent God and also be human freedom at the same time. They're fundamentally contradictory. So if being human means having free will, because our minds are free and we can to some extent control our thoughts, actions, etc., our words, and there's an omnipotent God who's all-knowing, all-seeing, and makes everything happen, those both can't be true at the same time, because then we wouldn't be free. God would be controlling all of our actions, yes? And that is an example of an antimony that requires a new way of thinking, a new kind of metaphysical mapping in order to make sense rationally. And this mind-body problem that we were talking about before with Descartes is kind of similar. And so for Kant, the world of human experience, the phenomenological world, is one realm. So there's the phenomenal realm or phenomenal world where we have sensory perception. It's imperfect. It's rudimentary. It's pretty mediocre. For almost each one of our senses, there is an animal that has that sense times orders of magnitude better than we do, right? There are animals who have senses that we can't even experience, so like sonar or electromagnetic fields. They can see colors that we can't, right? So we know scientifically, it's not like conjectures from an old dead white man. We can scientifically verify that our senses are really bad. But that is kind of what we have. So there is the phenomenal world. And then secondly, there is also something called the noumenal world or noumenal realm. And these are the worlds of absolute truths. The only things that exist in the noumenal realm are things like eternity, peace, the soul, and God. We can never actually know these things. We can only know them imperfectly as they come to us. And we can use reason to get a closer approximation. In the same way that we can use mathematical proofs to demonstrate that 2 and 2 are 4, or anyone do like geometry so far in high school, right? So you could take a thing, like geometry is the thing that most high schoolers take in math, where you have to do proofs, right? You like prove a thing is true. And so imagine if geometry was just, we look at 1,000 simulations to figure out the area of a rectangle, or that the hypotenuse and the two sides of the triangle is Pythagorean theorem or whatever, right? We just look at we can look at it enough and be like, yeah, like this is probably true, or we could come to an absolute certainty. And in math, we could often come to absolute certainty about conclusions, and it's just using reason. And for Kant, the gap that exists between the human world and the noumenal world is one that can be bridged. So in my reading, it's probably the case that it's asymptotic, right? So we can never quite perfectly get there. But as we get closer and closer and closer, right, we take more and more and more pictures and zoom in further and further and further, we get slightly closer to figuring out the area of the curve. And there is also, for Kant, 2 different gods. There is the phenomenal God, the one we experience, the one who forgives us upon our deaths, who says, these are the 10 commandments. And then there's the noumenal God. And the noumenal God is the one who is totally omnipotent, predetermines everything, knows all of the things in advance, etc. And that there is a gap between the noumenal world and the phenomenal world. And so it is possible for us to have freedom, have the freedom to choose and to act, and then be forgiven at the end for our sins. And it is simultaneously possible that there is a God who is the omnipotent creator who knows everything, and that those 2 things are not inconsistent if we imagine a separation between the world of being, the world of becoming, for in Platonic terms or in Aristotelian terms, or the separation between phenomena and noumena for Kant. The reason that the antimony stuff is so important is because if we accept that there is a gap that exists, the way you resolve this when answering what does it mean to be human and what we do as a human requires a global transcendental standard. So transcendental means beyond the human subject, beyond our ethics. And we have to figure out a way to attempt to bridge these two things. Because unless our standard for how to be in the world is transcendental, exists beyond us, unless our morals or our reason or our code exists beyond our own experiences or our own thoughts, we will be forever trapped in the shadows. We will always be stuck in the cave. We will never be able to find the light. And we may never find the light, right? Kant is, I think, he's not pessimistic about this. I think that Kant thinks that given enough time and enough intelligence and enough rational thought and enough, thinking about the problem, we could come to the correct conclusions, but it's very difficult to do it. So Kant has a bunch of different antinomies. And these often take the form of thesis and antithesis. So the first antinomy is of space and time. The thesis is that the world has a beginning in time and is also limited in terms of space. The antithesis of this, the world has no beginning and has no limits in space. It is infinite in regards to both time and space. So this is depending on how much physics you know, you may agree or disagree with these premises, but the time and space one is interesting for him and interesting for me because it can both simultaneously feel like time doesn't exist and time does exist. So it can both feel like we live in a really small world that is confined and has constraints, but also one that is completely limitless and expanding all the time. And figuring out why is it the case that both of these contradictory things seem true at the same time? What happens when the philosophy that is thesis, antithesis, conclusion, what happens when our conclusion is that both the thesis and the antithesis are equally true statements? And that kind of happens a lot in philosophy. And instead of attempting to have certainty through experience, instead of trying to empirically demonstrate that there is some synthesis of the two possible, right? The kind of Hegelian dialectic of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. What if instead of being Hegelians, we instead accepted the possibility that two contradictory things can be true at the exact same time, and instead realize that one exists in the world of experience and one exists in the world of infinity, infinite time, infinite space, the world of the noumenon God. So from all this, we eventually end up with his ethical system, so the categorical imperative. And because in order to leave the cave, to figure out what it means to be human, to identify the difference between human and substance, requires a transcendental system of ethics, we are necessarily bound to that system of ethics. And we ought to bind ourselves to a system of ethics that strives to achieve universality and strives to protect the notion of human reason as having infinite worth and infinite value. And it is these metaphysical questions and these metaphysical investigations that I think are important for getting the formulas for the categorical imperative of universality and humanity. The third one about autonomy it is not yet clear to me from my reading why that necessarily follows from the first two, but the autonomy one is basically just that if we all couldn't independently come to the same ethical conclusion given enough thinking, then we cannot will that onto others, because to will it onto another would be coercive in nature. So that's pretty much all I have time for. I don't want you to be too late to other stuff. I know it was a lot of non-Kant, and again, I don't totally know how much this can translate into IP debates, but I do hope that you've learned at least something interesting.